we've seen in conferences like this and other conferences that are sprouting luckily all over the place, we are researching what are the potentials of altered state of consciousness. And in this talk, we will explore how how altered state of consciousness have been used specifically in the beginning of our Western culture, in our indigenous times, especially in Greek and Roman times. And since I only have about 20 minutes, we're going to focus specifically on Dionysus, because he is really part of our cultural heritage. And also because his cult was so popular that we can really analyze the whole evolutionary trajectory of the cult from its very beginning until the Roman times, and then the advent and the end of it with the advent of Christianity. And we will look specifically about the social and political context that around this Dionysian cult. So, altered state of consciousness have been practiced in Greek and Roman times abundantly. Many were the rituals. And Dionysus was one of the main divinity. So who is Dionysus? Dionysus is usually associated to the fact that he's the god of wine and intoxication. But actually this is a sort of later Hellenistic and Roman interpretation of his cult, because a more primordial association to Dionysus is the fact that he's a vegetation god. So the names, the epithets associated with him are the power of the tree. So this is how people would call him. He represents the power of the tree, the blossom bringer, the fruit bringer. So primordially, Dionysus was the embodiment of life impulse to reproduce itself, the vital impulse itself. And Kereni, one of the main researchers on Dionysus and much more, he calls him the archetypal image of indestructible life. So life impulse to reproduce itself. There is a short video that I can show you here, just briefly, to give you a more palpable feeling of what this kind of energy is about. Oops. So I guess we got an idea of what I was talking about. And so subsequently, Dionysus is also associated to the god of sexual pleasure, because that same energy that pushes the trees out of the seed is the same energies that pushes people towards each other. And so this is, he's famous for being associated to sexual pleasure. And Euripides calls him the lord of the dance and the giver of ecstasy. So he's always associated also to celebration. And so Dionysus was always a bit of an outsider in the Greek pantheon. He's kind of the guy that is there, but he belongs and not belong to the official Greek pantheon at the same time. And the reasons for this is the fact that his rituals were very wild and extreme, and the fact that many of his followers belonged to the so-called inferior categories of people for the standards of the time. So he was very popular among women, homosexuals, or gender liquid people, and slaves. So we start to look closer at his cult by looking at the very beginning of it. So at the most initial part of his cult, the rituals were performed by women only. We are talking about something like the 8th century before Christ. So we're talking about 500 years before Alexander the Great, 3,000 years ago, more or less. And so the ritual that would be performed by women only would be called orebasia, from the words in ancient Greek, eis oros, which means to the mountain. So the orebasia would be performed by women that would be called the Maenads, that would be translated as the mad women, the raging women. And they would perform this ritual about every 2 years, leaving their city in a group of women with the young, the old, and the maidens, Euripides says. So the mothers, the younger women, and the older women, or post-menopausal. So a varied group of women would leave the city barefoot, with hair down, dressed with fawn skins, and wearing crowns of ivies, and bearing this Tirsus wand that is always represented with them, with a pine cone on top. And they would run on the top of the mountains in the wintertime. So what would they do there? Of course, everything that happened there is covered by secret. And of course, the only sources, literary sources we have is from men, which were banished from these kinds of rituals. But we can still infer enough about the rituals to have an idea more or less what happened. The Maenads are experts of trance dancing, and they're also experts of trance music making. So they would be able to play the tympanon, the frame drum, in a way to induce an altered state of consciousness through repetitive beats, and also through saying these repeating single words or sentences, like "to the mountain," for example, would be one of them. And so through these very specific and ancient rhythm patterns that would be transferred from the older women to the younger women, they were able to induce in the group an altered state of consciousness. So this would be one of the techniques of ecstasy that they would use, together with the ingestion of mind-altering substances. So what were they? Even if Dionysus is associated with wine, these kind of rituals happening in the middle of the winter probably were not about wine. Wine would be used then after spring, when the new wine would be ready. And the Maenads, in a way, they can be seen as the great-great-great-grandmothers of the witches. So they would be experts in all kinds of herbs, barks, roots, and leaves, and fruits, and seeds. And they would be able to mix them and know the doses, and probably every group would have their own recipes. And here we see an image where we can see how the brew would be mixed using different kinds of ingredients. Another technique of ecstasy that would be used is ritual sexuality, because this is a common practice in ancient fertility rituals dating back from primitive times, and also because there would be a constant of later Dionysian rituals that would be performed more like in an urban setting during the Hellenistic times. So all these techniques of ecstasy would induce what Plato called mania, or divine madness, that would be described as being possessed by the god himself. In fact, again, Euripides, in his tragedy, the Bacchae, he used the word daimon to refer to Dionysus, as opposed to theos, which is another word for divinity, but that would be associated to an anthropomorphic god. So daimon is a daimon, or like the word demon in English, would be a supernatural force that takes possession of the people through an altered state of consciousness in group ritual. So Bacchain would be not so much to revel, that is the literal meaning, but to really have a specific kind of religious experience, which would consist in becoming Bacchus himself, in becoming entheos, becoming completely possessed by the divinity. So we can already imagine that Masnadism did not affirm traditional feminine roles. In fact, it did not offer examples of appropriate behavior for women, running barefoot, hair down, without children, without the supervision of husband, on top of the mountains. So it actually legitimized alternatives and some measures of autonomy for women. So this is why Menadic rituals kind of started the spreading of negative rumors again around what the women would do on the mountains. and they would generally be referred to as perverted and dangerous. There is many different legends about what they would do, and they would breastfeed the animals and forget about breastfeeding the children at home, and inventing many different stories. And we have an example of this kind of negative view and judgmental view on what the women would do in the words of Pentheus, again from the Bacchae. Pentheus, he's the god of the town, he's the king of the town, and Dionysus is coming to perform rituals in his town, so he gets scared, and he says, I heard that the bowls are full of wine amid their feast, and they sneak off to this or that deserted spot to service men in bed, pretending to be some kind of raving priest, but serving, instead of Bacchus, love goddess Aphrodite. So he represents the typical kind of judgment that people would have, those ones that did not participate to the rituals. So in a way, he calls them prostitutes, which is a sort of like a default way to define a woman that doesn't behave according to the socially accepted norms of behavior. But in reality, what would these rituals be? They would be celebrations of life. As I said at the beginning, these rituals would be about honoring the impulse of life to reproduce itself. They would be experiences of deep contact with nature, with wild animals, with plants. And it was this deep and most intimate communion with the wilderness that they considered their spiritual practice. Also, these rituals offered the women the opportunity to have a deeper contact with each other, because already they would live separately from each other, and they would mainly spend their time inside the house. And also, this would be a way for them to express themselves genuinely and give vent to intense emotions. Also, these rituals would be training in liminality. Liminality is the state in between. So entering a state of liminality, already living the city, barefoot, with hair down, these would already be symbols of entering into a liminal state. And these trainings in liminality would help them to hold the paradox, a bit of what the lecture before was mentioned. Holding the paradox of being a bit of woman, but also man, and both a human and an animal. And using a substance that can be like a pharmacon, both a medicine and a poison at the same time. So having these experiences that would be what I called trainings in liminality. So with time, the cult of Dionysus became open also for men, and entire families would be initiated. So the Thiasos that is mentioned here would be these private associations that would organize the different rituals. So people that were initiated into the rites of Bacchus would belong to one of these private associations called Thiasos. And so if these rituals were trainings in breaking the social boundaries for women, also experiences what it means to be half a woman, half a man. Also for men would be places to experience this breaking of these gender identities. So in fact, Aristides says, the rites of Dionysus customarily put women in the clothes of men as much as they dress men as women. And about Dionysus, what do they say? They say that Dionysus was quite soft and delicate of body, by far excelling others in his beauty and devoted to sexual pleasure. So he is a sort of effeminate god. And his cult, for all these reasons, became more and more popular. In the Hellenistic times, we really have a peak in his popularity. And so in the 2nd century, when Roman influence on Greece and Greek influence on Rome became stronger and stronger, Dionysus also was imported in the Roman pantheon and became Bacchus. So Bacchus is the Roman name for Dionysus, and the Bacchanalia would be the name of his rituals. And this more or less happened in the 2nd century before Christ. So many say that this phase of the cult was a sort of decadent phase. I use this picture to give an example of what this can mean. And probably it was, because actually we're quite late in the history of Dionysian cult. And and yes, probably there were examples of degeneration of the cult. My personal idea is that it's a bit like ayahuasca rituals now. You would find a very good group with a very good space holder, and you find charlatans that are just there to try to take advantage of the people. I think more or less would be the same kind of situation. But so the cult became extremely famous. Membership was open to everyone, as I said, also slaves and women and foreigners. Women had prominent positions. There were priestesses that were able to initiate men into the cult. And the rituals broke rigid conventions of gender, social status, and ethnic origin, creating a strong bond among the people participating, because together they were participating into something that was a sort of counterculture, as opposed to the mainstream culture of the institutional Rome. So when also members of rich families took part in these rituals, it created a big scandal. And so the Roman Senate started promoting a campaign to suppress the rituals. So we have the story narrated by Livy, and he says, "The movement still has no power, but it experiences a large increase in numbers, growing bigger every day. It has almost formed a parallel city." So because of this, in the 2nd century before Christ, we have what is called the Bacchanalia affair, the repression of the cults. And I put here the words of Consul Lucius Postumius, also referred to by Titus Livy, where he's addressing the public assembly of the Romans to convince them of the need to repress these rituals. If I said that there were many thousands of them, you would no doubt be terrified, unless I told you just what kind of people they are. A great part of them are women, and they are the source of this evil thing, just to be clear. Next are males, scarcely distinguishable from females, dancing frenetically, having lost their minds by lack of sleep, by drink, by the confusion and the shouting that goes on throughout the night. He goes on, "Citizens of Rome, do you feel that young men initiated by this oath of allegiance should be made soldiers? Will they take the swords to fight to the end in defense of the chastity of your wives and children?" So here he uses a strategy pointing to the fear points of the people to enact the repression, which is a strategy that is still used by today lawmakers. So the law that was finally written is called the Senatum Consultum de Bacchanalibus in 186 before Christ, and it declared that the priests of these rites, male and female, are to be sought out, not only in Rome, but in all market towns and centers of population, so that they should be available for the consuls. No one should ever attempt to celebrate these ceremonies anymore in Rome or Italy. So this was pretty much the end of the Bacchanalia in Rome. Livy says that after the dismissal of the assembly, the whole city was seized by extreme terror. The following night, many people were caught escaping and were arrested. There was such a flight from the city that it resulted in a depopulation. Those who were found guilty of Bacchic worship were condemned to death. All Bacchic shrines were destroyed. The next big hit against the ritual, against Dionysian rituals, but pagan culture in general, was the 380 AD, the Edict of Theodosius at Thessaloniki, that marked the end of pagan religions and the declaration of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. But probably there were many underground rituals and groups keeping on practicing the cult, if more than 300 years later, in the Council of Constantinople, the Christians felt the need to restate the fact that We forbid dances and initiation rites of the gods, as they are falsely called among the Greeks, since whether by men or women, they are done according to an ancient custom contrary to the Christian way of life. I go to the conclusion. So the cult of Dionysus is a Greek and then Roman adaptation of primitive practices of altered state of consciousness, thus providing an example of European historic shamanism. This cult belonged to a spiritual and cultural lineage according to which nature is sacred, gender is liquid. Altered state of consciousness are embedded in rituals to provide a personal experience of the divine while promoting equality, tolerance, and healing. Their practices and values question the very core of the newly born patriarchal culture, and because of their revolutionary potential, they were brutally repressed. So now that we are assisting to the crumbling down of the cultural paradigm that enforced the repression of these cults, we are faced with many challenges. We are faced also by the resurgence of the practices of altered state of consciousness. And I believe that being aware of what happened in the past, and especially also in our Western past, is very important. And being aware that there was already a cultural lineage in our Western tradition that had the same values that we are needing now, I believe it's very inspirational. Thank you.